I literally lost my ability to speak when my sister, Madison, announced her wedding. No, not because I was happy or shocked by her sudden decision. She and her fiancé, Blake, had only been dating for 6 months, and she always said she didn't need to get married. I was stunned by what she said immediately after the news, something that hit me like a cold shower in the middle of a hot summer, but I'll get to that in a moment. I'm Owen, 32 years old, and I work as a middle manager in an IT company, which sounds much cooler than it actually is, because the reality is this. My salary barely covers the rent for a tiny one-bedroom apartment in the suburbs and the loans I took out when my mother fell ill 2 years ago. Our family was never wealthy. Dad left when I was 10, leaving us with Mom and my younger sister, Madison, who was only 4 at the time. We lived very modestly, constantly scrambling to make ends meet. Mom worked 2 jobs just so we could afford decent food. I remember envying my classmates in school who had new sneakers or cool gadgets, but I quickly learned to suppress those feelings. Since childhood, I felt responsible for Madison. She was my little shadow, and then, as she grew up, she became the one I was supposed to look after. When I got my first proper job after college, I immediately started helping Mom with the bills and Madison's education. Madison was always the kind of person who wanted to live the good life. She viewed life through the lens of social media, where everything is perfect. Expensive restaurants, designer clothes, constant travel. She never appreciated what she had and always strived for more without putting in much effort herself. I, on the contrary, was always the one who worked myself to the bone to provide myself and my family with some kind of stability. Madison met Blake at a bar. He's 7 years older than her, owns a small construction company, and is apparently quite successful. At least, that's how she described him. I've only met Blake a couple of times. He seemed like a slippery guy to me, with that overconfident smile and his overly expensive watch. But Madison was crazy about him, and I didn't want to ruin her mood with my doubts. She constantly talked about how he spoiled her, took her to fancy places, and bought her gifts. I listened to it all, grinding my teeth because I knew it was all fleeting tinsel. But what could I say? Over the past month, their relationship had progressed at lightning speed. First, they moved in together, then they started talking about a shared future. I thought it was just another one of her passing infatuations, but I was clearly wrong. A month ago, last Sunday, Madison called me and urgently asked me to come over to Mom's for dinner. I immediately sensed something was wrong because she usually doesn't call me anywhere. It's easier for her to send a text. When I arrived, Blake was there too, looking like a cat who'd swallowed the cream. Mom was bustling in the kitchen, and Madison was sitting on the sofa with a radiant smile. I instantly knew a big announcement was coming. They announced their engagement, showing me a ring that, as Madison proudly stated, cost as much as my annual rent. I congratulated them, trying to look sincere, though something inside me was grating. The rush of it all made me uneasy, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Finally, Madison took my hand, looked me straight in the eye, and, lowering her voice, delivered the line that made me feel as if I'd been drenched in ice water. This was the exact thing that threw me off balance, leaving me speechless and with a feeling of complete absurdity about the whole situation. And this is what she said, looking at me with that innocent smile. "Owen, you're my brother, my family. Blake will cover half, and you, as my loving brother, will pay for the other half. The wedding is in 4 weeks." I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. She was talking about half the cost of the wedding, which, according to her, would be small, just 150 guests at a trendy country club. Me, who barely scrapes together money for my bills, was supposed to pay for this half. I literally lost my ability to speak when my sister, Madison, announced her wedding and demanded that I pay for half of it. That's when everything began. The silence that followed Madison's outrageous declaration was so thick I could practically chew on it. My mind was racing, trying to process the sheer audacity of her request. Blake just sat there, smugly swirling the wine in his glass, while Mom nervously rearranged the napkins on the table, refusing to meet my eyes. It was a perfectly choreographed family scene, except the victim, me, was completely blindsided. "Madison, are you serious?" I finally managed to ask, my voice sounding hollow even to my own ears. I didn't raise it. I didn't yell. The feeling was not anger, but a cold, heavy disbelief. "Of course, I'm serious, Owen," she said, her tone shifting immediately to that wounded, slightly petulant one she used whenever she didn't get her way. "It's my wedding. It's supposed to be the most important day of my life, and you're my brother. Family helps family, right? Blake is doing his part, covering half the costs. The other half is for the family to contribute. That's just how it works. That's just how it works." That line echoed in my head. How it works for her meant that I, the guy drowning in debt and barely making rent, was supposed to shell out what she later specified was $45,000. She mentioned the total cost was around $90,000, which to her was modest for a wedding at the Briarwood Club. $45,000. I could barely save $4,500 over an entire year, even if I starved myself. I looked at Blake. He finally spoke up, a condescending smirk playing on his lips. "Look, Owen, I respect tradition, but Mads really wants a big day. I told her I'd handle the major vendor costs, the venue, the catering. But she wants the extras, the custom dress, the live band, the open bar upgrade. I figured her brother would step up for the things that make her truly happy." It wasn't a request. It was a demand wrapped in saccharine family expectations and the assumption that I had secret piles of cash stashed away. They were painting this picture where Blake was the generous benefactor, and I was just the slightly reluctant but ultimately obligated family member. "Blake, I appreciate your generosity, but you don't seem to understand my financial situation," I started, trying to keep my voice steady, professional even. "I am renting a tiny place. I'm paying off medical debt for Mom, and my car is about to die. I literally have less than $1,000 in my savings account. I cannot afford $45,000. Not even a tenth of that." Madison's face crumpled immediately, not with understanding but with disappointment. The kind of look that said I was personally ruining her fantasy. "Oh, here we go," she sighed dramatically, throwing her hands up. "Always the victim, Owen. You're always talking about your debts and your rent. You're 32. Can't you just get a better job? Or just take out a loan? It's for me, Owen. You promised you'd always look out for me." That promise. That was the real emotional leverage they were using. When Dad left, I swore to myself and to Mom that I would always protect Madison. And for years I did. I paid for her college books, her phone bills, bailed her out of minor scrapes. I sacrificed my own financial growth for her stability. But this wasn't stability. This was funding an extravagant party for a man who could clearly pay for it himself, but chose not to, putting the burden squarely on me. Mom finally stepped in, placing a hand on my shoulder, but it wasn't a gesture of support. It was a gentle push. "Owen, honey, listen to your sister," Mom whispered, her voice laced with that familiar, weary guilt trip. "It's Madison's dream. Just for one day. Can't you find a way? You're so smart. You can figure it out. Maybe talk to the bank. A quick loan. You'll pay it off. Think about how happy you'll make her. Blake is a good catch, and this wedding needs to be perfect for her future." My own mother was siding with them, completely minimizing the reality of my financial struggle. They weren't seeing me. They were seeing an ATM with a brother label. The realization hit me hard. They genuinely believed I was holding out, that I was being selfish and ungenerous, rather than financially crippled. The following week was a blur of phone calls and texts. Madison kept sending me links to florists and photographers, attaching passive-aggressive notes like, "Just showing you where your half will be going. It's going to be so beautiful." I kept ignoring the messages, hoping the problem would somehow dissipate, but it only escalated. I spent my evenings running numbers. Loan options, second jobs, selling my beat-up car. Nothing added up without completely destroying my future and leaving me destitute for years. I was in a moral and financial corner, and the clock was ticking because Madison wasn't asking for money next year. She needed a deposit for the vendors by the end of the month. For short weeks, the emotional weight was crushing. I wasn't just saying no to a request. I was saying no to the one person I'd sworn to protect, under the watchful, judging eye of my mother. I felt the slow, steady erosion of my self-worth. Was I really being an egoist, as my mother's silent gaze seemed to suggest? The possibility gnawed at me, turning the usual monotony of my work and life into a constant, low-level dread. I had to find a way to make them understand, but the more I tried to explain the reality, the more they seemed to dig in, convinced I was just being difficult. I knew the next confrontation would be explosive. It was only a matter of time before the accusations started flying. The second week of the 4-week countdown felt like a financial siege. Madison's passive-aggressive texts had evolved into outright hostile phone calls. Every time my phone rang, I felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in my stomach. She wasn't just showing me pictures of flowers anymore. She was demanding answers, and her tone was quickly poisoning our already strained relationship. The actual conflict that erupted, however, was worse than I anticipated. It happened on Wednesday evening when I finally agreed to meet them, Madison, Blake, and Mom, at Mom's house. I thought a face-to-face talk might lend some reality to my desperate situation, but I was wrong. The moment I walked in, I could feel the hostile air. Blake was lounging on the sofa, scrolling through his phone, completely aloof, as if this entire conversation was beneath him. Mom was hovering, anxiously smoothing out imaginary wrinkles on her apron. Madison was waiting, coiled and ready. "So, Owen, did you call the bank?" Madison asked, skipping any form of greeting. Her eyes were hard, not the eyes of my little sister, but of a tough negotiator. "Yes, I did, Madison," I replied, taking a deep breath. I needed to be calm, rational. I spoke to my loan officer. Given my existing debts, the medical bills are still substantial, and my current salary, they won't approve a personal loan for $45,000. It's too high a risk for them. I literally don't have the collateral. The color drained from her face, not in sadness, but in fury. "You won't or you can't, Owen? Because it sounds like you're just making excuses. You could liquidate your 401k, couldn't you? Or sell that awful car and use the money as a deposit for a high-interest loan. You're just not trying hard enough." I felt a surge of genuine anger, the kind that starts cold in your chest and turns your voice into a low rumble. Liquidate my retirement savings? Sell the only way I have to get to my job? Are you listening to yourself? Madison, I am barely pulling off the rent every month. I'm living paycheck to paycheck. This isn't a small sacrifice you're asking for. You're asking me to bankrupt myself for your one-day party. Blake finally looked up from his phone, injecting his unwelcome opinion into the conflict. "Come on, man. It's just money. You'll make it back. You're making this into a much bigger deal than it is. Your sister is right, you're the family. You need to step up. Mads is giving up a lot to be with me, and I'm taking care of the important things. The family should take care of her wishes." His wishes. He, the wealthy future husband, was outsourcing the cost of his fiancé's dream upgrades to her financially strapped brother, then having the audacity to call it family obligation. The real emotional blow came when Madison delivered the ultimatum, her voice trembling with manufactured drama. "You know what, Owen? Blake and I can't finalize the bookings for the florist or the band without that deposit. If we lose the venue or have to cut the guest list, it's all gonna fall apart. This wedding is everything to me. It's our start. If you refuse to help, you're not just saying no to the money, you're saying no to my future. You're a selfish egoist who only cares about his own miserable apartment and his stupid debt, and you don't want to see me happy." The word egoist hit me like a physical punch. It was the same word Mom used in her silent, disappointed looks over the past week. Mom stepped closer, her eyes welling up with tears, which was her ultimate weapon. "Owen, please, don't ruin this for her. I'm so proud that she's marrying Blake. Just think, if you help now, he'll remember that. It's an investment in her happiness, honey. Don't be the one who stands in her way. She's your sister. Are you an egoist, Owen? Do you really want her to think that?" I was cornered. I saw the three of them, a unified front of accusation, expectation, and emotional blackmail. Blake's indifference, Madison's dramatic fury, and Mom's weaponized guilt. They had neatly flipped the moral dilemma. I was the villain. I was the obstacle standing between my sister and her happiness. All because I refused to destroy my already precarious life for her lavish demands. The tension was excruciating. Was I, after years of sacrificing my own well-being for this family, now the selfish one for finally drawing a line? The credits and the rent were my reality, a heavy, cold weight. The wedding was their fantasy, a shimmering, expensive bubble. And I was being forced to burst my reality to fund their fantasy. I didn't answer Madison's question. Couldn't. My mouth was dry, and the words, "I can't," felt too weak. Too much like the excuse they already believed it to be. I just looked at my sister, seeing not the little girl I protected, but a calculating woman willing to sacrifice me on the altar of her material aspirations. The bond, the deep, fundamental loyalty I'd felt my whole life, was cracking under the immense pressure of a $45,000 demand. I knew right then that I had to make a decision, and it wouldn't be one that would make any of them happy. The clock was still ticking, and the deadline for the major vendor deposits was now only 2 weeks away. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken accusations and the horrifying realization that my sister's future happiness, as she saw it, was directly tied to my financial ruin. I felt the overwhelming urge to run, to escape this suffocating room and the moral prison they had built for me. I had to find an angle, a truth they hadn't considered. After the explosive confrontation at Mom's house, I couldn't sleep. The word egoist kept spinning in my head, mixed with the chilling number, $45,000. 2 weeks remained until the vendor deposit deadline, and I was paralyzed. I knew that if I caved, I'd be setting myself back a decade financially, but if I stood firm, I'd permanently fracture my relationship with my sister and face my mother's lifelong disappointment. The week that followed was spent in a suffocating silence. Madison stopped calling, but the stream of expensive wedding mood boards and passive-aggressive texts didn't stop. They weren't demands anymore. They were a constant visual reminder of what I was allegedly ruining by simply existing within my financial constraints. I decided I needed to understand Blake's financial situation better. It made absolutely no sense that a man who owned a successful construction firm and bought Madison a ring that cost my annual rent couldn't cover the full $90,000 wedding cost, especially when he was putting up half already. It wasn't about the money for him, it was about power, control, or perhaps something darker. I spent an entire evening digging online, something I never usually do. I started with his construction firm. The company website was glossy, all high-resolution photos and vague mission statements. But then I checked the public records. That's where the first crack in his perfect facade appeared. Blake's firm, Blake & Sons Contracting, had 2 active lawsuits filed against it in the last 6 months for breach of contract and unpaid supplier invoices. That wasn't necessarily a death sentence for a business, but it signaled instability. Successful companies don't usually rack up civil suits for non-payment. This was the first hint that the successful part of his profile might be a carefully constructed lie. I felt a sickening knot form in my gut, but I kept digging. I looked up his property records. He lived in a beautiful house, a fact Madison constantly brought up, but the mortgage was astronomical. Not only that, but the house was leveraged to the hilt. He had taken out a second mortgage just 8 months ago. This was not the financial behavior of a man who was comfortably successful. This was the behavior of a man trying to stay afloat by shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. The puzzle pieces were starting to align, forming a deeply uncomfortable picture. If Blake was financially strained, why was he insisting on an extravagant $90,000 wedding and demanding that I pay half? Why was he pressuring Madison to marry him so quickly, after only 6 months? Then came the real gut-wrenching plot twist. I remembered Madison mentioning in an offhand way that Blake was selling some heavy equipment from his firm to cover some unexpected business expenses. It sounded innocuous at the time. I decided to check the local commercial vehicle registration database. It's public, though tedious to navigate, for vehicles registered under his company name. I cross-referenced the equipment Madison mentioned with the records. The heavy excavator and 2 dump trucks were listed as being sold exactly 3 weeks ago. But the records also showed something else, something I almost missed because of the small font. A third vehicle, a brand new Audi A8 registered in Blake's name, was also sold the same day, for a surprisingly low price to a title loan company. That luxury car, the one Blake drove and often used to show off his success, was gone. Why sell a brand new, high-end personal vehicle at a loss unless you were absolutely desperate for liquidity? I realized then that Blake wasn't asking me to contribute to the wedding because of some outdated family tradition. He was asking because he couldn't afford the wedding either. He was using Madison's dream and my family loyalty as a desperate financial lifeline. He had promised Madison a lavish wedding to secure her and her family's financial assistance, or at least a large cash injection from me. The implication was terrifying. Madison wasn't just marrying a man who had financial trouble. She was potentially marrying a man who was on the verge of bankruptcy, who was manipulative enough to use her brother's guilt to fund his escape route or maintain his facade. The moral dilemma shifted dramatically from, am I selfish for not paying? To, am I complicit in my sister's financial ruin if I do pay? If I gave him the $45,000, I would be enabling his poor choices and potentially pulling my sister and myself down with his sinking ship. If I didn't pay, I'd destroy her dream and confirm their belief that I was the egoist, but I might save her from a catastrophic marriage. The clock showed exactly 10 days until the vendor deposit was due. I had to confront Madison with the truth. The cold, hard evidence I had uncovered about Blake's true financial state. But how? She was so blinded by her love and the fantasy of the good life that she would never believe me. She would see it as a desperate, selfish attempt to sabotage her wedding to avoid paying. I was holding a ticking time bomb, and the final decision, to reveal the truth and risk everything, or stay silent and enable the disaster, was now inevitable. The tension was no longer about money. It was about saving my sister from a man who might be using her as his last, best financial asset. I knew what I had to do, but the emotional cost would be immense. I had the proof, the cold, digital trail of Blake's desperation. The lawsuits, the leveraged house, the hasty, low-priced sale of his luxury car. Everything pointed to the fact that he was financially collapsing, and he saw my sister's wedding as a $45,000 cash injection to stop the bleeding. The moral weight was crushing me. I couldn't enable this, but how do you save someone who is convinced you're the enemy? With only a week left before the vendor deposit deadline, I arranged one last meeting. This time, I made sure it was just Madison and me. I told her I had finally decided how I would proceed with the wedding contribution, which was technically true. We met at a neutral coffee shop, far from Mom's house and Blake's influence. When she walked in, she looked exhausted, but also defensive, armored against my expected refusal. She didn't hug me. She just sat down, pushing her coffee cup away. "So, what's the big announcement, Owen?" she asked, her voice flat, devoid of the warmth I remembered from our childhood. "Are you finally going to stop acting like a martyr and tell me you got the loan?" I slid the papers across the table. They weren't just printouts of public records. I had condensed them into a small, irrefutable dossier, highlighting the key financial indicators of Blake's downfall. The lawsuits, the recent leveraging of his home, and the dated receipt for the sale of the Audi A8, signed just a few weeks ago. "Madison, look at this. I need you to look at this, not as my sister, but as a clear-headed woman who built a future on hard work. Blake is lying to you," I said, my voice low and earnest. "He isn't just asking for money. He needs it to stay afloat. He's not the successful businessman he pretends to be. He's leveraged everything, and his company is facing multiple lawsuits for non-payment. He sold his Audi for quick cash a month ago. He doesn't have the money for his half of this wedding either." She didn't even pick up the papers immediately. She just stared at them, then at me, and a terrifying, cold look of pure rage swept across her face. You went digging?" she hissed, her voice barely above a whisper, yet vibrating with fury. "You snooped into his private life because you don't want to pay? You have sunk to a new low, Owen. This is pathetic. You're inventing problems because you're jealous. You can't stand that I'm happy and moving up, while you're stuck in your miserable little apartment. She finally snatched the papers, her hands trembling violently, and quickly scanned the highlighted sections. Her eyes flickered over the lawsuit titles, the date on the Audi receipt, and the mortgage details. For a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of doubt, a raw, naked fear, but she instantly buried it under a layer of furious denial. This is nothing. This is business. Companies get sued all the time. He told me about the car. He said he was selling it to invest in new equipment. You twisted this to fit your miserable narrative, didn't you? You didn't want to pay, so you decided to ruin my future instead. Madison, he's using you. He's using your wedding, and he's using my supposed guilt to bail himself out. If you marry him now, you won't be walking into a high society life. You'll be walking straight into his debt and bankruptcy. I pleaded, the emotional dam finally breaking. I was fighting for her, for the promise I made years ago. She threw the papers back onto the table, scattering them with a dramatic slap. Tears, real ones this time, streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of betrayal and disappointed fantasy. No, you know what, Owen? I'm done. I don't need your money, and I don't need your toxic paranoia. If you loved me, you would have supported me without trying to tear down the man I love. Blake is a good man, and he's under stress, and I will stand by him. But you're dead to me. You are the biggest egoist I have ever known. You would rather see me miserable than spend a dime on my happiness. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly across the floor, drawing every eye in the cafe. The wedding is still on, and I promise you, you and your little dossier are not invited. You won this one, Owen. You kept your precious money. Congratulations on destroying your sister's wedding. She turned and walked out, leaving me sitting there, surrounded by the scattered evidence of her future disaster and the shattering silence of our broken relationship. I felt an intense, agonizing mix of relief and utter devastation. I had saved my money, saved my future, and possibly saved her from financial ruin, but I had lost my sister in the process. I did not pay the $45,000. The wedding, to my shock, did not get canceled. Instead, it was dramatically scaled down. A few days later, Mom called, her voice heavy with shame and resignation. Madison had booked a small ceremony at the courthouse and a modest reception at a local restaurant, covering the reduced cost herself, which meant Blake had contributed next to nothing. Mom didn't mention Blake's lawsuits, but she admitted, in a tired whisper, that something must have happened with his business. She didn't press me further. The $45,000 problem disappeared, but the emotional chasm remained. 2 weeks later, the day of the wedding, I received a text from Madison. It was a single photo of her in a simple white dress, holding a tiny bouquet, standing next to a stiff-looking Blake. The text underneath read, "We did it. Hope you're happy with your choice, Owen." I looked at the photo, then at my bank statement, which, though still showing minimal savings, no longer had a pending $45,000 withdrawal. I was safe financially. But was I happy? I saved myself from financial collapse, but I destroyed the illusion of family loyalty that had defined my life. The question that haunts me now, months later, is not whether Blake was broke, or whether Madison was blinded by ambition. The real question is this: when does loyalty become a liability, and when does self-preservation become selfishness? I saved my future by confirming I was the egoist in their eyes, leaving me with my money, my stability, and the chilling realization that sometimes the hardest sacrifice isn't giving away what you have, but accepting the permanent loss of the people you once loved. I'm free of the debt they wanted to impose, but I am utterly alone with the heavy burden of my undeniable, yet necessary choice.